Okay, let's get started. Good evening. Welcome to the second in this year's program of speakers sponsored by the Nonfiction Writing Program in the English department here at Brown. My name is Carol DeBoer-Langworthy, and I teach in that august program, which addresses all forms of nonfiction, academic essay, journalism, and creative nonfiction. My main job tonight is to tell you to turn off your electronics, so please turn them off, not just turn them down so that they bump and buzz in the night. Our talk tonight is co-sponsored by Modern Culture and Media Department, and our speaker is Mark Feeney, the Pulitzer Prize winning culture critic for the Boston Globe and a visiting professor of English in the nonfiction program this year. He also chairs this year's selection committee for the Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction, so he's becoming quite an expert on the most current iterations of that genre of writing. Mark graduated from Harvard in 1979 in the History and Literature program and immediately went to work for the Boston Globe, where he specializes in covering the arts, particularly photography and film. Tonight he's going to talk about writing his book, Nixon at the Movies, which the bookstore has just reordered to restore their stock of this interesting volume. So I hope you will join me in welcoming Mark. And he tells me there will be no images on the big screen, so you may want to migrate a little bit this way. All right, thank you.
Yes, you're stuck with just me and the man I refer to as the big guy. Before I start, it's 7:10. The polls don't close for 50 more minutes, so if you haven't voted, I would urge, and if you live nearby, I would urge you to do so. I'm not kidding. Email me, and I'll email you the text, but that's more important than I am. All right. Okay. So much for the civics aspect of this talk. Good evening, and thank you all for coming. Let me begin with a warning. I have a fondness for indirection, and slightly indirectly is how I intend to begin this talk. Also, I should tell you something I tell my students. I like sentences with lots of proper nouns in them. That way I learn more things. And so such sentences will largely, if not completely, populate this talk. All right then. John Hay, a notable name in the history of this university, and even more notable name on its campus map, was Henry Adams' best friend. Henry Adams began his Mont Saint-Michel in Chartres with a sentence of thrilling simplicity and inspired directness and also indirectness. The archangel loved heights. I must confess that I was tempted to begin Nixon at the Movies with an homage to that sentence, the president loved screens. That love was twofold. Richard Nixon loved screens in the sense of concealment. That comes as no surprise, of course, not with a man so imperially ill at ease and single-mindedly secretive. He also loved screens in the sense of showing, or more specifically, as a field for showing projected images. Jean-Paul Sartre described motion pictures as the frenzy of a wall. Richard Nixon was highly susceptible to that frenzy. Now that is a surprise. It certainly was to me, and my book emerged from discovering that susceptibility of Nixon's. To that susceptibility I shall soon return. Let me bring back Henry Adams for a further bit of indirection. It was in his education that I first encountered Gibbon's famous description of where, in October 1764, he resolved to write his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Quote, in the close of the evening, as I sat musing in the church of the Zoccolanti or Franciscan friars, while they were singing vespers in the temple of Jupiter on the ruins of the Capitol. It's a wonderful accumulation of prepositional phrases. But, not to get competitive with Gibbon, I can tell you with even greater precision when and where I started to write my own book, though the setting was considerably less impressive. It was in the rather shabby living room of my house in North Cambridge, Massachusetts. This was the morning after Richard Nixon's death. He died on April 22nd, 1994, a date no doubt all of you could have easily supplied if asked. My friend David Thompson telephoned me that morning. David, as some of you may know, is one of our best and most worthwhile writers on film. You may be familiar with his biographical dictionary of film in one of its many editions, or in his work as the film critic for the New Republic. Although by then a U.S. citizen, David grew up in England and had moved here in the mid-'70s, so the hours of Nixon footage on CNN and C-SPAN, Nixon and Alger Hiss, Nixon and the Checkers speech, Nixon and the kitchen debate, Nixon in the 1960 election, Nixon in the 1962 California gubernatorial election, Nixon and not being had to kick around anymore, and let's not forget the famous cameo on Rowan Martin's laugh-in, "Sock it to me?" All these had hit him with the force of revelation. He'd stayed up through the night, transfixed in front of the television. Say what you will about Richard Nixon, the man was nothing if not transfixing, albeit rarely for the right reasons. So my friend and I talked about Nixon. You know, I said, you should write about Nixon in movies. No, he said, you should. Well, I thought to myself, why not? Nixon had long fascinated me. He still does. That fascination primarily springs from two sources, I think. At the time of his first inauguration, I was 11. When he resigned, I was 17. Those years, as we all know, are highly impressionable. They are when a young person comes of age. I suspect that anyone interested in politics, and I was intensely interested in politics, will always have a special attachment to whoever was president at that time in his or her life. More than that, though, Richard Nixon was, and I know no better way of putting this than to say, Richard Nixon. No other president has been a figure of national importance so long. No other American public figure, or at least none I can think of, has been such a train wreck of tics, contradictions, and psychic consternation. I would contend that there have been only two presidents who possess the sort of complexity and contradiction worthy of a great and enduring character in fiction. One is Abraham Lincoln. Need I point out that John Hay was Lincoln's private secretary and biographer? I do need to point out that the young Richard Nixon read all 10 volumes of that biography, co-written with Hay's fellow secretary, John Nicolay. The other president, you guessed it, is Richard Nixon. Don't laugh. Nixon is Iago, Richard III, Malvolio, rolled into one, with a touch of Thucydides and even Prospero, that being Nixon's final elder statesman phase. Name me one other president who qualifies as a one-man Shakespearean repertory company. So, my friend knew of my long-standing Nixon interest. Maybe obsession is a better word. He also knew of my keen interest in film. That had been the origin of our friendship. But Nixon and the movies. On the face of it, this sounds preposterous. But not really. Anyone with more than a passing familiarity with the man knows that there were multiple intersections between Richard Nixon and Hollywood. His wife, Pat, had paid her way through USC working as a studio extra, and in fact, she can be very briefly glimpsed in a ballroom scene in Ruben Mamoulian's 1935 adaptation of Thackeray's Vanity Fair, which has been renamed Becky Sharp. Nixon had been on the House Committee on Un-American Activities at the time of its notorious Hollywood 10 hearings, and as the sole Californian on the panel, he had done a lot of carrying of water for the studios. His opponent in 1950, when he was elected to the Senate, Helen Gahagan Douglas, had been a movie star and was married to a movie star, Melvin Douglas, and several of Nixon's leading financial backers had been Hollywood executives. But that was all in Nixon's past. Even as president, there were well-known movie connections. Nixon had gotten into brief flare-ups over the movies, in fact. Asked about the Manson case, you'll remember Charles Manson, the notorious mass killer of was it 1969, 1970? Nixon had cited the frontier justice of a John Wayne Western, Chisholm, as a suitable model of jurisprudence. He had lamented the off-color language in Love Story. Yes, that love story. I know these words. I know young people use them, he told reporters. It's the in thing to do. Profanity, Nixon went on to say, has its place. But if it is used, it should be used to punctuate. 40 months later, the White House transcripts were released wherein expletives, deleted and otherwise, did a lot more than punctuate. Above all, there was Patton. Anyone who knows anything about Nixon and movies knows about Patton. Nixon had this is the film starring George C. Scott. It won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1971. Scott won, though he declined, the Best Actor Oscar. and Nixon had it screened before he ordered U.S. troops into Cambodia, and then twice again during the incursion, bringing along aides to the screenings to buck up their spirits. Ever since, it's been taken for granted that Patton was Nixon's favorite movie. As I'd learn, it was not. I will tell you shortly what was. And there was the matter of a movie we can be sure was not a Nixon favorite, All the President's Men. So yes, Nixon in movies, Nixon in Hollywood. Surely there was a lively and perhaps even illuminating essay to be written on the subject. I mentioned earlier that Nixon died in April 1994. The 20th anniversary of his resignation was 2 months later. One last time, he demonstrated his flair for the dramatic and knack for dodging bullets. Not least among those bullets Nixon dodged was the Haldimand Diaries, which were published slightly more than 3 weeks after his death. How to describe H.R. Haldimand to those too young to have known the dark chill of his presence in public life during the early 70s? He effectively created the template for White House Chief of Staff, a monster of crew-cut efficiency. If ever there was a man who knew the secrets, it was Bob Haldimand. Yet Nixon had had nothing to worry about. The diaries had few revelations to offer. Fascinating in their terse, uninflected way, the entries are as much to-do lists, or Haldimand being Haldimand got-done lists, as anything else. To the extent the diaries contained any revelations, they concerned Haldimand himself. The man had been gadget-happy. He dictated the entries on a tape recorder. He was an enthusiastic amateur photographer and even more enthusiastic home movie maker. Later on, as consumer technology developed, he kept up with it. In his will, permitting publication of his diaries, they appeared posthumously. Haldimand had died in November 1993. He directed that there also be a CD-ROM edition. Remember, this was 1994. CD-ROMs were seen as the next big thing, and Haldimand thought to take full advantage of their capacities. The CD-ROM of the diaries would include snippets of his dictation, examples of the photographs he'd taken, and Super 8 footage Haldimand had shot at the White House and during various presidential travels. There was one other bell, or was it a whistle? Click on a link at the end of each entry, and there would appear that day's presidential daily diary, the term used for Nixon's schedule by the Secret Service, which maintained it. I mentioned the White House transcripts earlier. Nixon always said that he taped his conversations for posterity's sake. This rationale inspired almost universal scorn. I don't think that's justified. A passionate student of history, Nixon hungered to loom large in it. He knew that the more material historians had, the more interesting he might appear to them, and if he could control the release of that material, control it, let us say, so as to better burnish his reputation, so much the better. To see this concern for posterity demonstrated, all you need to do is compare the presidential diary of John F. Kennedy with that of Nixon. The latter's thoroughness of detail mocks, even indicts, the former's almost scandalous scantiness of detail. Perhaps that was because thoroughness would have recorded for posterity some of the scandalous personal doings of the president? That I cannot say. The point is that Nixon, unlike Kennedy, had his activities recorded down to the minute. Here is where my proposed essay became book, and the surprise of Nixon's dual relationship to screens was sprung upon me. The Haldimand Diaries wasn't the only Nixon-related book to appear that spring and summer. Publishers love anniversaries, of course. There was a bounty of Nixoniana. Then as now, as Carol mentioned, I worked at the Boston Globe. I proposed to the Globe's book editor doing a roundup of these books. She agreed. She also agreed to the headline I proposed, a headline of which I remain proud all these years later. It consisted of one word. Those of you of a certain age will recognize its provenance: wallowing. Obviously, the Haldimand Diaries would figure in this roundup. Now, as it happened, I had recently acquired my first computer. It will seem unthinkable to those of you of a different age that someone well into his 30s would not have a computer, but this was back in the 20th century. Such things did happen. I had a computer. I also have something of a completeness fetish. Something is a euphemism, actually. I have a completeness fetish the way Richard Nixon had a 5 o'clock shadow. It's there, it's nasty, it's unmistakable. So I suggested reviewing the CD-ROM, which had the full text, unlike the book, which has only about 60% of the text. If you're going to jump into the pool, it might as well be the deep end, even if it's owned by H.R. Haldimand. So, a nightly ritual began to take shape. I'd get home from work, go for a run, make dinner, and eating my meal at the computer, read my way through that evening's quota of Haldimania. It really is a remarkable document. It's boring and banal, briskly inert, and somehow, precisely because of those qualities rather than despite them, it's curiously compelling. It's hypnotic even. And at the end of each entry, I'd click on the diary. I found something that staggered and enchanted me. Richard Nixon was crazy for movies. And I'm not kidding. This glum, grim, grinding man was enthralled to the silver screen. Again and again, listed after dinner, there would be, most every Friday and Saturday night, and sometimes on a weeknight. A weeknight. How many of you go to the movies on a weeknight? A single startling word. Movie. What was going on here? As I would later learn through my researches, Nixon attended 528 screenings during the slightly more than 5.5 years of his presidency. So roughly 100 movies a year. How many of us watch 100 movies a year? Even with access to DVDs and Netflix, which of course didn't exist back then. Most of the screenings were at the White House, but also at Camp David, at Key Biscayne, at San Clemente, his vacation homes. Some were current. He saw both Love Story, so he knew whereof he spoke, and The Godfather within days of their opening. Others were movies from Hollywood's golden age, the period when he, like so many of his contemporaries, enjoyed moviegoing as a regular, even redemptive habit. Some of the movies were classics: Citizen Kane, The Maltese Falcon. A lot were junk. A few even had digs directed at him. The Candidate has Robert Redford mocking Nixon's outthrust V for Victory stance. The Way We Were, also starring Redford, has a character from Southern California in the late 40s saying in a cocktail party that his congressman is on the Hollywood 10 committee. It has to be Nixon. Like any true movie lover, and I hope this won't offend any film scholars who might be here, Richard Nixon was promiscuous in his movie-going. Yes, he had preferences. John Wayne was his favorite actor, John Ford his favorite director. He loved musicals. He did. He really did. He especially loved Rodgers and Hammerstein. And his favorite movie, I will now finally tell you, was Around the World in 80 Days. He had it screened 3 times, one of them at Camp David as a special birthday treat for Treasury Secretary John Connally. He loved it so much, he wanted to share it. But even bearing in mind Nixon's preferences, it was just watching a movie, any movie, being alone in the dark with those larger-than-life images on a screen that mattered more to him than what the given movie was. What the frenzy on the wall was didn't matter so much as the simple fact of the wall being frenzied. I find this wonderfully humanizing about the man. Ronald Reagan was the movie star as president. John F. Kennedy was the president as movie star. Richard Nixon was one of us, the president as movie fan. So, with that fact as foundation, a fact at once astonishing and mundane, I began to think of not just an essay, but a book about Nixon and the movies. The more I thought about this, the crazier my thoughts became. What about looking at Nixon's life and career as refracted through certain films and or film genres? And why not? Vice versa. Here were 2 remarkable products of 20th century America, Richard Milhous Nixon and Hollywood. Let's put them together and see what happens. As I tell my students, the greatest problem any piece of writing poses is structure. As I also tell them, no small part of the appeal of writing about a life is that it presents you with a structure, courtesy of chronology. You don't have to use that structure, of course, but it is there. This is what I do with Nixon. The themes were there for the writing: class resentment, criminality, militarism and machismo, the intricacies of Washington, battling the press, the entanglements of Watergate, and so on. Arrange the themes chronologically as a kind of shadow biography. Attach each to a film or film genre, or in one case, a song, and then write away. I do not write the chapters in order. What would be the fun in doing that? I can tell you that the first I wrote was the one about the press. My line of work being what it is, how could I not start there? The film was sweet smell of success that louche and acridly stylized portrait from 1957 of a Broadway gossip columnist played by Burt Lancaster. The vast preponderance of newspaper movies, and there have been many, many newspaper movies, present the journalist as hero. There are a number of historical reasons for that, as I explain in the chapter. This is one movie where the journalist is anything but a hero, so it's very much a movie Richard Nixon could relate to. The last chapter to be written was the first, in chronology. Nixon, as you likely know, was a Quaker. He was also, as you likely don't know, a cousin of the novelist Jessamine West. Jessamine West's best-known work is a short story collection, The Friendly Persuasion, about Quaker life in the Civil War era. It was made into a movie, minus the article and the title, directed by William Wyler and starring Gary Cooper. For some reason, I kept putting off seeing it, or rather, I kept putting off writing it and seeing it because the two are bound together. Once I did see it, I realized that I'd hesitated for a good reason. Not only is the movie a dud, and dudness, that's a technical term, can sometimes be useful, but it really didn't relate to Nixon at all. It was bland, anodyne, it just didn't work. So what would I choose? The classic Bette Davis woman's picture, Dark Victory, did. It did? You might wonder. It has nothing to do with Quakerism in Southern California, but it does touch on class resentment and someone dying far too young, as two of Nixon's brothers did. Some of the movie chapter pairings are obvious, even inevitable. Watergate, All the President's Men. An aside, much as Richard Nixon loved to watch movies while he was president, he is not the champion presidential movie watcher. Would anybody care to guess which president watched more movies while in office than anyone else? Pardon? No. He lived it. Why watch it?
I think it has to be Bush, the recent one.
James Earl Carter Jr. Jimmy Carter watched a ton of movies. I think part of that was because he had a small child who lived in the White House. But I also think he loved movies, and he was something of a culture vulture. The reason I mention this, the first movie Jimmy Carter had screened as president, just a few days after he was inaugurated, was All the President's Men. What the rest of us enjoyed as a real-life thriller, the most momentous newspaper movie since Citizen Kane, Carter got to experience as a cautionary tale. All the President's Men reminds me to note an oddity I discovered concerning the presidential daily diary. At the time I began researching my book, all of the Nixon presidential papers were stored at the National Archives facility in College Park, Maryland. They are now in the process, finally, of being moved to the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, California. Why they've taken so long to end up there is a very interesting story of its own, one that involves federal legislation, Supreme Court rulings, and multiple lawsuits. Excuse me, it's the Jarndyce versus Jarndyce of presidential papers, which come to think of it, Bleak House wouldn't be a bad name for any residence that Richard Nixon lived at. But that story takes us too far afield. So back to College Park. As I mentioned previously, the Nixon Presidential Daily Diary is exceptionally, I would go so far as to say providentially detailed, until one gets to mid-December 1973. Then, boom, it changes. What had been page and a half, 2-page, in some rare instances even 3-page entries now consistently shrink to half a page, if that. And none of those entries contain any reference to movie, let alone the title of what that unmentioned movie may have been. Nor was Haldimand's diary any help. He had been fired 6 months earlier. The reason for this change, I subsequently learned, was Woodward Bernstein, or rather their specter. Hence all my President's Men reference. Nixon, not unreasonably, became obsessed with leaks about daily life in the White House. By this point, anything might seem incriminating or at least unflattering. And with his presidency tottering, even the merest hint of unflattering information could work very much against him. So the less information on record that might become public, the less damage could be done. And by this time, the administration was very, very deep in damage control mode. Now, this presented me with a problem. The thing I'm proudest of with this book is its appendix. It's a listing of all the movies Nixon saw and when and where they were screened. In its teensy-tiny way, it's a contribution to scholarship, since in no other place are all the titles listed. If only as an index of taste, it's a window into an establishment, Richard Nixon's psyche, whose proprietor did his lifelong best to keep the shutters closed. So I had all these titles up through December 73. How to find the rest? I was at an impasse until I again heard from my friend David Thompson. He lives in San Francisco. An article had appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle about presidents and their movie-going habits. It was written by a former Los Angeles Times arts editor who was involved with a documentary on the subject. David had his number. Might this man have this information? He didn't, but he knew someone who did. That was a gentleman named Paul Fisher. He had been White House projectionist from 1953 to 1986 and had kept a log of all the films he had screened for the presidents. There were more than 5,000 entries in all. Given Fisher's telephone number by that editor, I called him. He was somewhat wary. Who wouldn't be, having spent so much time in the dark with all those presidents? Finally, he agreed to help. I sent him a stamped, self-addressed manila envelope along with a check for Xeroxing expenses, and a week or so later, I got my information. I have digressed considerably from all the President's Men. Let me then quickly conclude by telling you the other films that gave me my chapter titles. Double Indemnity, for noirish Nixon, a figure of criminality and fixture of Southern California immorality. And if you've ever seen that film, in your mind's eye, conjure up the image of Fred McMurray. And if Fred McMurray in that film doesn't look like the young Richard Nixon, well, my name's Barbara Stanwyck. Patton and Mr. Roberts, a twofer for Nixon and the military. Advise and Consent for Nixon the legislator. Two Rode Together for Nixon and Henry Kissinger, the richest and most charged relationship between president and aide in U.S. history. Even more charged than that between Theodore Roosevelt and our friend John Hay. There's Frank Capra's little-known but truly extraordinary film, American Madness, about Nixon and crisis. Not a film, but a song, Suspicious Minds, for Nixon and Elvis. How could I not have a chapter on Nixon and Elvis? You all, of course, know that Nixon and Elvis met in the Oval Office, and to this day, the single most requested item from the National Archives are photographs and postcards of the two of them together. American id and American superego in embrace. A chapter on the movies Nixon saw, and finally, The Conversation on Nixon's relationship to 70s Hollywood. Finally, there's an epilogue on Nixon in the movies, a subject worthy of its own book, and there have been several, in fact. In Howard Hawks's marvelously autumnal 1959 Western Rio Bravo, which Nixon saw at Camp David on November 28, 1972, Ward Bond says to John Wayne about his ragtag band of deputies, "That's all you've got?" The Duke replies, "That's what I've got." Well, me too. I will tell you, though, as a kind of postscript, that my original plan had been to include 3 other chapters. 2 of them I'm just as glad I abandoned. One would have been for its film, The Women, and the chapter would have been Nixon and the female sex. His marriage, his relationship with his mother, which is quite complex, with his 2 daughters, his devoted secretary, Rosemary Woods, and the fact that the one opponent he had in running for the Senate was Helen Gahagan Douglas, a woman. It's also worth noting that Nixon was the first president to seriously consider naming a woman to the Supreme Court. He didn't do so, of course. And at his daughter Julie's urging, he read The Feminine Mystique in 1972. And I ask you, has any other president read Betty Friedan? I suspect not, though that may change come 2017. The other chapter would have been Resurrection, the film being a 1931 vision of Tolstoy's last novel. The chapter subject being Nixon's post-presidential career. The connection? Believe it or not, Nixon, acting on the suggestion of a favorite professor, had spent much of one summer while he was an undergraduate reading Tolstoy, doing so with pleasure and admiration. Again, we find the man's capacity to surprise. The chapter whose abandonment I regret, that would have been on Haldimand. The title would have come from television, An American Family. That was the PBS reality series from 1973 that showed the crack-up of an affluent Southern California family, the Louds. The Haldimands, let us say, did not fare as well in the East as they had back home in Hancock Park. Like Nixon, the actual man was much more interesting than the public perception of him. But that chapter, as I say, never got written, which is too bad, since I really do owe him one, don't I? That's it. Thank you all. If anyone has a question, I'd be happy to try to answer it. Nixon, the movies, or anything in between. Yes.
You mentioned, and I totally agree, that organization is often the most difficult thing. Were there other ways that you thought to organize the book? I think it's so really exciting, the themes matching the film.
It was such fun. It just sort of came out. It was like, in a funny way, should I keep talking into this? I guess, yeah. It was like being a matchmaker, I honestly can't remember which came first in some cases, the theme or the movie. I mean, many of the themes are obvious. I know in the back of my mind for like Southern California, the second chapter in criminality, I can vividly recall seeing Double Indemnity at the Brattle Theater in Cambridge in the early 80s and just being so struck by the similarity between Fred McMurray and Nixon at that time. And Nixon, as some of you may know, was a lawyer in the late 30s and early 40s. Fred McMurray's character is an insurance salesman, but they're both young professionals on the make. So that one just sort of wrote itself almost. The others, they just came out. And I will tell you another secret about my book. The actual subtitle is a book about belief, but in my mind, my subtitle for it, which I just didn't have the chutzpah to give it, was and is a book about belief, a book about America. And I think that most of the themes have as much larger relevance to American culture as they do to Nixon, so I dare say that was another element in choosing some of the ones that I did. I'd say that's off the record, but I guess it's not. Yeah.
Do you know if either in interviews or in any other, in the diaries or whatever, he talked about movies specifically?
There are bits and pieces, and part of the fun of the book was tracking them down. Like, for example, after he moved, it's funny, for people of a certain age, Nixon stuff, it's just, they get offended if you start explaining, oh yeah, I know that. Whereas past a certain point, it's like, Richard who? But as some of you know, he ran for governor of California in '62. He was quite ignominiously defeated, and then he moved to New York. And this was a big deal, and the New York Times ran a personality profile of him. And in the course of it, it came up that he'd been going to the movies a lot, and he was asked what his favorite movie of 1963 was, and it was The Great Escape, a film I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And so he talked about The Great Escape. A number of memos where he talks about movies. In August '72, after his renomination, there was a reception at San Clemente for the Hollywood community. And there are a number of memos where he talks about the guest list, and he clearly really cares about it. There are articles about that reception, which tended to be people Jack Benny's age or older, not a sampling of the new Hollywood. Though Peter Bogdanovich was there with Sybil Shepherd. So there are all these various odd bits and pieces that would come out. Here, and another example, in 1973, as many of you know, the American Film Institute gives an annual award, Lifetime Achievement Award. And the first one was presented to John Ford. And Nixon, as a sign of his reverence for Ford, agreed to be the presenter. And also presented with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which, as you know, is the highest civilian honor available to an American. And if you ask me, the three greatest moments, it is one of the three greatest moments in Richard Nixon's life, because after he presents it, Ford, who will be dead in a few months, is helped up to the podium by John Wayne and Charlton Heston. And he begins by saying that this is 1973, early 73, the POWs have recently returned because the Paris Peace Accords, peace so-called, had just been signed. And Ford begins by saying, like so many of you, I was watching the TV with tears in my eyes, with my rosaries, saying, God bless Richard Nixon. Here's Richard Nixon. John Ford, like the American of Americans, is saying, God bless. It's hard to beat that. So there are these many moments which I've done my best to, put in there without overdoing it, and put them in a larger context of Nixon's career and, American culture generally. It was a lot of fun. Yeah. Anyone else? Nobody wants to know what the other two greatest moments are? You do? All right. Meeting Mao. World history, geopolitics. It's Hegel on the hoof, And the other, you're going to laugh at this, but I am convinced it was one of the three greatest moments, maybe the greatest moment of his life, when Julie marries General Eisenhower's grandson. It is, dynastic union. And one point, my favorite Nixon /movie observation isn't mine. It's from Gary Wills. And it's not even in Nixon Agonistes, the first third of which is the best thing that's ever been written on Nixon. The second two-thirds, he gets all theoretical and it's not worth reading, but the first third is magnificent. It's in his book, The Kennedy Imprisonment. And he points out, and it's so obvious, if you watch Patton, and it's not a good movie, though George C. Scott's magnificent. Patton's, who afflicts Patton throughout that movie? It's not Rommel, it's not any Nazi general, it's not Field Marshal Montgomery, it's Ike. It's Eisenhower who's always treating him badly and putting him in the doghouse. And who was the person who again and again humiliated Richard Nixon? It wasn't the Kennedys. It was Dwight D. Eisenhower. Once it's pointed out, it's so obvious. So to have his daughter then marry his grandson, talk about, up yours. Dynastically speaking. Yeah.
Well, I'm very excited about the way that you use cultural criticism to sort of look at the history, and I'm
Yeah.
curious whether there are other new projects that you're working on now that are doing similar things, or what you are working on now.
I'm working on a book in the 70s. But it's very sort of scattered. It does, Nixon's a great organizing principle, both because he evolves so much over time. What's that term that they use about characters in movies? What a story arc he has, or character arc. But also he encompasses so many things. But this isn't going to have any central. The only unifying thing is the decade itself. So it's a bit of a cheat, since of course the decade is a specious construct, but it's a useful specious construct. I suppose those are the two basic categories in life: specious constructs and useful specious constructs. And this is a useful specious construct.
How long
Yeah.
did it take you to write it?
Well,
Very beginning to
yeah.
end.
Well, it gets tricky because it bumps up against economic issues. I started writing it in the fall of '94, and I finished it in like 2002, but it was basically done by about '98. But everybody told me the hard part, and I don't know, I'm sure there are many of you here who have published books, everyone told me, oh, getting an agent, that's the hard part. Once you get an agent, you're all set. And I got an agent like that. It took me a long time to get a publisher. If, I'd had a contract to do it, then it would have been quicker. And if also the first 2 years I was an at-home dad, and then I had a day job, and so for a long time I just described it as my hobby. Kind of a bizarre hobby, and then it happened. Anyone else?
Did you keep a diary during the sleuth periods where you were tracking down one thing after another?
Well, I keep a journal, but I don't know that it was specific to Nixon. sort of the story behind the story. No, that would have been too frightening.
And something I just wondered, how much do you think Nixon thought about the movies, so to speak, as an art form?
That's a great question. I don't think he thought about it at all, and that was so much of the appeal for him. Nixon was someone who thought about how to click a pen, which is part of the reason why he was terror. I mean, he was physically. Alexander Butterfield, the man who revealed the White House tapes, famously said that he was so uncoordinated he had a hard time using a ballpoint pen. The beauty of the movies was that this intensely self-aware, self-conscious man could sit in the dark and just look at the screen. And, you know, he had preferences, of course, but he didn't. Yeah.
You said on his own in the dark.
Oh,
how much was
good.
he on his own?
There are, it varies wildly. A couple times he watched movies with J. Edgar Hoover, often his family, of course, but not always, because he was the movie mad one. There was one instance where, I forget the exact date, but he did watch a movie by himself. And there's a quite charming quote, several quotes from Julie, talking about Nixon would refuse to leave, no matter how bad it was. He would say, no, this will get better, stick it out, show a little faith, which I find very charming. And the one instance I have found of him walking out, and it's so bizarre, it's in Haldimand, he was watching West Side Story, and according to Haldimand, Nixon walked out dismissing it as propaganda. Now, propaganda for juvenile delinquency, for young love, I don't know, but that's the only instance I'm aware of where he walked out. One thing I should mention is the procedure. The Motion Picture Association of America is headquartered in Washington, and its main task, basically, is to stay on the good side of the government. So for a very long time, it has provided movies to the sitting president. A list of available films would be sent over, and then the president, or a designee, sometimes he would have one of his daughters or his friend Bebe Rebozo choose the movie. Again, a sign of Nixon's movie love. You know, he would let someone else do it because he just wanted to see a movie. He wasn't that specific about it. And so they would send over movies, and there was this projectionist on staff who would then screen the movies for him.
I
Yeah.
can't help thinking, I'm sure it's an accidental association that I probably shouldn't be too proud of, but I think
Pride has nothing to do with Richard Nixon.
I think Wittgenstein, who would lecture.
Whose favorite movie star was Carmen Miranda.
There you are. And he would lecture with tremendous intensity, and afterwards something, so we're told, of a sense of shame at the inadequacy of what he'd done, and would try to grab someone from the front row and say, can you come to a movie with
Yeah.
me? And
That's,
day after
yeah.
day, he would grab some. I mean, he liked movies. I presume one other thing that it did is it gave a form of personal contact which doesn't involve talking to somebody.
exactly.
And,
Exactly. Yes.
And
Yeah.
it completely, I mean, if you manage to get absorbed by it, then it saves you from regret at whatever wasn't
Yeah.
exactly, I mean, so a highly self-critical person in extremely difficult circumstances
Right.
finds this a tremendous refuge.
Absolutely. And you can say, well, he could go to a play. No, he couldn't, because there are other people there. And all.
To talk to people in the interval.
Yeah, right, exactly. Whereas a movie, and we've all had this experience. I mean, yeah, movies you go on a date or you go with friends, but there are times you just go to a movie and the lights go down and you're by yourself and these literally larger than life images on the screen, and there's a kind of salvation to it. So I never would have guessed this beforehand, but in retrospect, it makes perfect sense. And it also, I mean, Kennedy was famous for getting up and walking out during a movie. He didn't have that many movies screened, and he'd just get bored. And why would he want to watch? He lived a movie star life. Whereas for Nixon, it was, he loved these big splashy epics. He loved David Lean movies. He wanted a life larger and richer than his own. And he was the president of the United States. But I hadn't thought of the Wittgenstein is very interesting. And there's a wonderful Wittgenstein quote, which you're probably familiar with, Justin, where he, in his notebooks, where he says, I've often gone to, and it doesn't mean trashy, but a vulgar or an inferior American film and been pleased and transported by it. But this never happens with an English film. And if you think about English movies, yeah. Well, actually, I was telling, this came up in class with my students. I once, forgive me for name dropping, but I once did a phone interview with Jean-Luc Godard. And as you know, he does not like the United States, and with good reason, in many respects. But somehow it came up about Hollywood movies, and he sort of sighed and said, I do not understand why it is, but I could see a very fine Norwegian film, and it won't entertain me as a Hollywood movie will. And it was like, it was true, so he had to say it, but he wished he didn't have to say it. Somebody here had a question, I thought? Okay. Yeah. I'll try to give an off-the-wall answer. I'm sorry, what? Oh, Barton Fink. Barton Fink. Oh, yeah. And which is really weird, of course, because Barton Fink is Jewish, and we know about Nixon and the Jews, but that is further befits the situation because the three memoirs of Nixon that are the most insightful are by Jewish associates. Kissinger's memoirs, Leonard Garment, who was his law partner and later legal counsel, and William Safire, speechwriter. And I remember I did very few interviews for the book. Much for all kinds of reasons, both logistical and intellectual. I relied on documents and books. But I did talk to Len Garment, who was a wonderful man. And inevitably, the issue of Nixon anti-Semitism came up, and he just kind of rolled his eyes and said, Nixon was a boy chick. He was a Jew like the rest of us. He was an outsider. And that was a really interesting observation. Maybe it's just repelling I don't know. But I would say Barton Fink. But yeah, he is very kind of Coen Brothers-ian, isn't he? Yeah, I never thought of that before.
What's your assessment of Oliver Stone's Nixon?
It's this. It's a version of Citizen Kane. And I mean, really, you look at how it opens, the White House is like Xanadu, and I like the fact that he does have some sympathy for Nixon, even though I was about to say I don't share Nixon's politics, but with this Republican Party, Nixon, looks like FDR. But you can't deal with Nixon artistically without some sympathy for him. And I just don't think the film works. And I think the biggest problem, of course, is Anthony Hopkins, who, every time you see him, he's imitating Richard Nixon. That's Anthony Hopkins imitating Richard Nixon. I think the greatest, most persuasive performance as Nixon has the performer's the advantage of singing the words, and that's James Madalena as Nixon in John Adams' opera Nixon in China, which it's just great. You get that sense of the man's, like his dreams and how they're coming to fruition, but also his clumsiness, and it's all there. It's wonderful. And if any of you aren't familiar with it, it's great music too. But that tells you something, Richard Nixon. What other I think there's like a one-act opera about Jefferson, but other than that, I don't think there are any operas about other presidents. And that's a whole nother issue. All the works of art that Nixon inspired, novels and short stories and poems. He's this weird kind of anti-muse. As you can see, I can go on for about Nixon forever, so you may want to flee. Yes.
I'm just curious, were there many comedies in
Oh yeah,
this
a fair
movie?
amount. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is in the book or not, I can't remember, but I did break them down by genres, which of course gets tricky because there's some overlap. But after westerns and musicals, I think comedies were the next largest, had the next largest representation. But part of that had to do with his relatively indiscriminate taste. No, if you look, it reflects Hollywood releases.
Right.
You know, a large portion of Hollywood releases are comedies. So if you just get this list and you kind of just say whatever, you're going to get a fair number of comedies. Yeah. And also, I do think he wanted to keep Pat happy, and she wanted the lighter side. Well,
Any more questions? All right, well,
okay. Well, thank you all very much.